The operations center pulsed with red light, the kind that made every heartbeat sound louder. Radios hissed, maps flickered, and the smell of burnt coffee hung in the air. 12 Navy SEALs Bravo 6 were pinned somewhere inside the Korangal Mountains, a stretch of rock and shadow the pilots called the Devil's Mouth. The last thing anyone heard from them was an 8-second burst of static and a calm voice saying, "No rescue. We'll hold the line." Silence followed. No one breathed. The commanding officer lowered his headset, jaw tight. Then a single chair scraped against the floor. Major Elaine Kitt stood, her flight suit half-zipped, eyes fixed on the glowing map. Someone muttered, "She's not serious." "That canyon eats jets alive." Elaine's reply came quiet but steady. "Then I'll fly lower than the canyon." The SEAL commander exhaled, defeated. Even I gave up on that one. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Major Elaine Kitt was 34, but to the younger pilots at Bagram Forward Air Wing, she might as well have been from another era. She didn't strut into the ready room with swagger or chew sunflower seeds while bragging about kill counts. She carried herself with quiet discipline, precise, measured, unflappable. When she spoke, it was because something needed to be said. And when she flew, even her critics had to admit, the sky seemed to move around her instead of the other way around. Her flight record was flawless, but she had earned a reputation that didn't fit the Air Force's modern rhythm. Some called her too cautious, others, a technician, not a warrior. She'd flown longer, lower, and truer than most of them, but that didn't matter to the new generation of pilots raised on screens and simulations. They joked that she was a manual-era pilot in a digital cockpit. Elaine never corrected them. She just smiled the way people do when they know time will sort the noise from the truth. In the flight hangar, her presence was subtle, but magnetic. She had a habit of walking the perimeter of her A-10 before every mission, fingertips brushing the metal as if checking its pulse. Ground crew said it looked like she was talking to the aircraft. Maybe she was. To her, the Warthog wasn't just a machine, it was a living, breathing partner forged from titanium and stubborn willpower. "If you listen close enough," she once told a mechanic, "the Warthog tells you what she can take." Most didn't understand her kind of flying. They wanted speed, power, drama. Elaine wanted precision. She believed that in war, survival depended less on muscle and more on rhythm. Her past explained why. She'd grown up outside Wichita, Kansas, flat land, endless fields, skies painted with sunlight and dust. Her father, an Army colonel who flew transport planes, taught her early that altitude was only useful if you respected the ground below. "Always know where home is, no matter how high you climb," he used to say. But the real inspiration came from watching the crop dusters. Those daredevil pilots flew so low the wheat seemed to kiss their wings. Elaine would sit for hours, tracing their paths with her eyes. One summer, she convinced a pilot named Earl to take her up in the second seat. He showed her how to ride the thermals, how to feel the air instead of fighting it. When they landed, he looked at her and said, "You're not afraid of height. You're afraid of wasting it." Years later, that instinct carried her through the brutal grind of flight school at Laughlin Air Force Base. She wasn't the fastest or flashiest cadet, but she was the one instructors remembered. One flight trainer, Lieutenant Miles Avery, once said, "You don't fly the A-10, Kit, you wear it." It stuck. Still, respect was slow to come. In her early career, she was often passed over for combat slots in favor of more aggressive pilots. Some of her peers whispered she only got her chance because her father's name was still painted on the Wall of Honor. Elaine ignored it. She had nothing to prove to them, only to the soldiers she'd one day protect. Her defining moment came during Operation Gatefire, 5 years before the Korangal crisis. 2 friendly jets had been struck by anti-aircraft fire during a storm over northern Afghanistan. With radio systems down and visibility near zero, command ordered all aircraft to abort. But Elaine refused. Using the flashes of lightning as navigation points and the mountain contours she'd memorized from topographic maps, she guided both crippled aircraft back to safety. When the debriefing officer asked how she did it, she simply said, "The storm showed me the way." That was the day she became Stormhauler, the pilot who could ride the chaos instead of running from it. Yet fame never interested her. The call sign embarrassed her more than it flattered her. She preferred silence to celebration, and in the competitive culture of fighter squadrons, that humility was mistaken for weakness. In the months before the Korangel mission, she'd been quietly assigned to low-priority Overwatch flights, monitoring convoys and training new pilots. One of those pilots, Lieutenant Harris, once muttered in the briefing room, "She's good at flying straight lines." A few laughed. Elaine didn't react. She was watching the wind readings on the monitor, already planning for the next mission. That night, she sat alone in the hangar long after the others left. Her A-10, tail number 81110, loomed in the dim light like a beast at rest. She walked beneath its wings, tracing the faint dents and scorch marks from old battles. Every mark had a memory, each one a promise kept. She ran her hand along the metal and whispered under her breath, "You and me, Ripjaw. We still got work to do." She always called her aircraft Ripjaw, after the way the A-10's GAU-8 cannon chewed through armored steel. But to her, it wasn't about destruction, it was about precision, about giving those on the ground a fighting chance. The Warthog wasn't a sleek predator like an F-22 or a speed demon like an F-16. It was slow, loud, and unyielding. And in that stubbornness, Elaine saw herself. On her locker, a small photograph was taped inside the door. It showed her standing beside her father in uniform, both smiling, a C-130 in the background. His handwriting below the picture read, "Never fly higher than your heart." Those words had guided her through every mission. They reminded her that flying wasn't about ego or rank, it was about trust. Trust in the machine, the air, and the people waiting below. In the officer's lounge, she often sat apart, sipping black coffee, while others swapped stories about near misses and air-to-air duels. She didn't interrupt, didn't correct their boasts, even when she knew they exaggerated. What would have been the point? War would humble them soon enough. Still, there were moments when even her calm cracked. On rare nights, when the base lights dimmed and silence settled over the desert, she'd step outside, stare at the sky, and remember the voices of those she couldn't save. Flying low meant seeing the faces on the ground, their fear, their hope, and sometimes their last breath. So, when the Korangel alert sounded that night, when she heard that 12 men were about to die in a canyon no pilot dared enter, it wasn't adrenaline that moved her, it was memory. Because Major Elaine Kitt didn't fly for medals or headlines. She flew for the people who still believed help could come from the sky even when everyone else had given up. The tent buzzed with static and tension, the kind that makes even the canvas walls seem to hold their breath. Screens glowed pale blue in the dark, the hum of generators mixing with the clipped chatter of radio operators trying to raise a team that no longer answered. The call signs on the monitor, Bravo 6, 12 Navy SEALs, blinked red one by one, vanishing into silence. Colonel Harrell leaned over the map, his knuckles pressed white against the edge of the table. "They're pinned here," he said, tapping a digital marker deep inside the Korangel Mountains. "A canyon inside a canyon. The locals call it the Devil's Mouth." A tech officer adjusted his headset. Enemy positions on both ridges. RPGs, mortars, and confirmed heat seekers. No signal from their JTAC. "Sir, they're surrounded." The words fell heavy, final. Another officer exhaled through his nose. "Command has already classified it as a lost team. No air insertion possible." Elaine stood near the back, still in her flight suit, arms crossed. Her eyes stayed fixed on the live feed, a topographic mess of jagged lines and red dots. She zoomed in slowly, tracing the winding path through the canyon. The elevation data shifted into a nightmare of sharp inclines and vertical walls. One of the younger pilots shook his head. No way through there. Even a drone would crash before it cleared the turn radius. Someone else muttered under his breath, loud enough to be heard. "You'd crash before you even saw them." Another voice joined in. A-10s weren't built for that altitude anyway. The laughter was small but sharp, like the crack of ice. Elaine didn't turn. Her voice came out steady, low enough to command attention. No aircraft was built for this canyon, she said, but the Warthog's tough, and she's mine. Silence followed. Even the hum of the radios seemed to fade. Across the room, the SEAL commander, grizzled, arms folded, watched her for a long moment before shaking his head. His voice was gravel. "We've already written them off, Major." Elaine turned fully then. Her gaze didn't waver. "Then let me unwrite it." The tent went still. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Harrow straightened, his jaw tight. "Major Kit, this isn't hero time. That canyon's a coffin. You know it, I know it. We wait for nightfall, send in helicopters, maybe." "By nightfall, they'll be gone," Elaine replied. Harrow's eyes hardened. "You're not volunteering yourself into a suicide run." "I'm not," she said softly. "I'm volunteering into a chance." The colonel rubbed his forehead. "You flew there once during Gatefire, didn't you?" Elaine nodded. "Route Charlie. I memorized the terrain. I can stay below radar, under the missile envelope. If I thread the southern corridor, I can mask behind the cliffs and engage from the blind side." An intelligence officer scoffed. "That's theory, not flight science," Elaine pointed at the topographic overlay. "That's instinct." "There's a difference," the tent murmured. Arguments rose, voices overlapping, flight clearance protocols, radar interference, chain of command. But her voice cut through all of it. "You're planning a rescue that'll come too late," she said. "Let me get eyes on. If I fail, you lose 1 aircraft. If I don't go, you lose 12 men." Colonel Harrow slammed his hand down. "Enough, Major. You're grounded until further notice." The words hung in the air like a slap. Elaine didn't flinch. She just turned toward the exit. "Sir," she said quietly, "then you'll have to court-martial me when I get back." A stunned pause. Harrow stared at her, searching for something, fear, hesitation, but found none. He finally looked away, jaw clenched. "You've got 1 hour to prep, and God help you if you make me regret it." "Yes, sir," she said. The command tent erupted into motion. Technicians scrambled, issuing override clearances, adjusting flight grids. Pilots watched her go, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others in something that looked like respect. Outside, the night was a black ocean. The runway lights burned dimly in the dust. The A-10 sat waiting under the floodlights, tail number 81110, Ripjaw. Its dull gray body bore the scars of past missions, scratches that glimmered faintly under the sodium lamps. Airman Riley, the youngest crew chief on base, jogged up beside her, wiping his hands on his coveralls. His voice trembled slightly. "Ma'am, they said you're actually doing it?" Elaine adjusted her gloves, her gaze locked on the aircraft. "Looks that way, ma'am. That's a death trap. Even the drones can't." She cut him off gently. "Riley, how long have you worked with this bird?" 2 years, ma'am." "Then you know she's stubborn." He swallowed hard. "So are you." Elaine smiled faintly. "That's why we get along." The young man hesitated, then reached into his flight jacket. "I made this for you. Was gonna save it for your birthday, but..." He held out a small patch. "Black thundercloud. Silver wings, stitched across the bottom in white thread. Stormler." Elaine took it carefully, thumb tracing the edge. "You sew, Riley?" "Only for legends, ma'am." She met his eyes, something soft flickering in hers. "Let's hope you made it strong. I plan on bringing it back." Inside the hangar, the maintenance team watched as she walked beneath the massive wings of the Warthog. The engines glowed faintly, their fans whispering in idle rotation. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon jutted from the nose like a clenched fist. She climbed the ladder, each step deliberate. The night wind howled through the open bay doors, carrying sand across the concrete. When she settled into the cockpit, the seat creaked like it remembered her. Riley secured her harness, his voice barely above a whisper. "You sure about this, ma'am?" Elaine glanced at the instruments, then at the dark horizon. "No one's ever sure." "That's why someone has to go first." He nodded, stepped back, and saluted. "Bring her home, Major." She returned the gesture. "Always do." As he turned to leave, she looked down at the patch resting on her glove. For a long moment, she just stared at it, the black thundercloud, the silver wings, and thought of all the storms she'd flown through. She pressed it against the Velcro on her left shoulder and whispered, "Let's fly, old friend." When the engines roared to life, the sound rolled across the airfield like thunder. Crews paused what they were doing, heads turning toward the hangar. Some saluted. Others just watched, eyes wide, as the Warthog taxied into the darkness. In the control tent, Harrow stood beside the SEAL commander, arms crossed. "You really think she'll make it?" the commander asked quietly. Harrow's jaw tightened. "She's not flying on chance," he said. "She's flying on memory." The commander stared at the radar feed where her transponder blinked once, then vanished into the mountains. Then God help her. Somewhere in that canyon, 12 men waited with their backs to the stone, surrounded by fire. And above them, cutting through the black sky, a single engine howled into the storm. The hangar hummed with a low, restless energy as technicians swarmed around Ripjaw. The A-10C stood like a beast of burden ready to break loose, its twin engines casting deep shadows under the harsh floodlights. Every rivet and scar on its gray skin told stories of the past, storms, rescues, firefights, all written in metal and carbon scoring. Elaine climbed the ladder slowly, her boots ringing against the metal steps. The air smelled of hydraulic oil and fuel, the scent of battle, of decisions that couldn't be undone. She paused halfway up, eyes locked on the open canopy, where the cockpit lights shimmered like a half-remembered memory. Her gloved fingers rested on the frame. For the first time that night, her hands trembled, just slightly, but enough that she noticed. Enough to remind her she wasn't fearless, just human. She exhaled, steadying herself, and climbed the rest of the way. Inside the cockpit, the world shrank to glass, switches, and shadows. Her reflection looked back at her in the HUD. Calm, focused, but with a flicker of doubt hiding behind her eyes. She reached up to secure her helmet, but before sliding it on, her wrist caught the light. A tattoo, a hawk beneath a lightning bolt, stretched faintly across her skin, half hidden beneath her sleeve. It glowed under the hangar's fluorescent glare, the ink old but defiant. Outside, near the wing, 2 young mechanics stood watching. Airman Riley leaned close to his partner and whispered, "You see that mark?" His partner shrugged, still wiping grease from his hands. "Yeah, what about it?" Riley's eyes darted toward the cockpit. "That's her, the one from Gatefire." The other man frowned. "That's just a rumor. They said that pilot never came back." Riley shook his head. "She did, just quietly." The man laughed nervously. "Come on, nobody flies through a snowstorm blind, not in a Warthog." Riley didn't answer. He just kept staring at Elaine, the faint tattoo flashing again as she locked her throttle into position. He'd heard the story, how, years ago, during Operation Gatefire, one A-10 vanished in a blizzard with 2 crippled jets on her wing. Command called it a lost mission. But someone had guided those damaged aircraft home through lightning and zero visibility. Someone who knew how to read the sky like Braille. They never said who. The logs were sealed, the flight path erased. But among pilots, the story lived on like a ghost. The pilot with the storm tattoo, the one who flew blind and survived. Riley's voice was barely a whisper now. "She's not supposed to exist." Inside the cockpit, Elaine adjusted her oxygen feed and ran through her final checklist. Each line read like a litany: hydraulics, green; weapons, armed, armed; countermeasures, minimal; altitude limiter, disengaged. A tone buzzed in her headset. "The control tower. Stormauler, confirm flight plan. You're cleared for takeoff on runway 17. She smiled faintly at the sound of her old call sign. "Copy that, tower." Ripjaw rolling in 2. As she spoke, her thumb brushed the edge of the tattoo again, a habit she'd picked up years ago, a reminder. A promise. Outside, the crew watched as the A-10's engines began to spin, the low growl deepening into a roar. The turbines kicked up a storm of dust that swirled around the hangar floor like smoke from an unseen fire. Riley shaded his eyes and muttered, "She's really going through with it." The other mechanic folded his arms. You think she'll make it back? Riley hesitated. If anyone can fly through hell and find the exit, it's her. Elaine's canopy sealed shut with a hiss. The cockpit lights dimmed to combat mode. Soft red glows, gentle beeps, and the steady hum of the systems coming alive. She pressed her gloved palm against the dash, just above the data screen, and whispered, "We've done worse, haven't we?" The instruments flickered like they were answering her. The radio crackled again, Colonel Harrow's voice this time, clipped and tight. "Major Kit, you're off radar the moment you enter the canyon. No comms, no visual. If you lose power, eject immediately." "Copy that, sir," she said evenly. "But if I lose power, I won't have time to eject." Harrow sighed audibly over the channel. "Damn it, Kit. This isn't about proving something." "I'm not proving anything, sir," she said softly. "I'm trying to stop a massacre." Silence followed. Then, quietly, "Godspeed, Major." The engine screamed as she rolled onto the runway. The night opened wide before her, a black ocean of sand and starlight. The floodlights flicked off one by one, as if the world itself was dimming for what came next. Riley stepped forward as the jet began to move, raising his hand in a small salute. The other mechanics joined him, the wind from the turbines whipping their uniforms. They watched as Ripjaw gathered speed, faster, louder, until its wheels left the ground. In the control room, Harrow stood beside the SEAL commander, both staring at the radar feed. The green dot labeled 8110, kick, EET, blinked once, twice, then vanished into the mountains. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of static. Down in the canyon's direction, lightning flickered against the horizon, faint but steady, like the beat of a pulse. Someone in the control center whispered, "She's gone dark." Harrow didn't look away from the screen. "No," he said quietly, "she's just listening to the storm." Out over the desert, Elaine's cockpit vibrated as she dropped below 300 feet, then 200. The terrain scanner screamed warnings, but she ignored them. Her hands steadied. The trembling was gone now. This was where she belonged, on the edge between control and chaos. The mountains loomed ahead, their shadows like open jaws waiting to swallow her whole. She smiled beneath her oxygen mask and whispered, "Show me the way, old friend." Her right hand brushed the patch Riley had sewn onto her sleeve. Stormuller, the thundercloud, the wings. And then she banked low, the engines roaring as the canyon walls closed around her. The last thing anyone at base saw was a brief flash of light, silver against the dark, before the radar went completely still. What would you have done if you were her commanding officer? Approve the flight, or stop her? The canyon rose like the ribs of a beast, each wall jutting skyward in serrated defiance. Elaine's A-10C, Ripjaw, dove straight into that darkness, the air so tight it felt like flying inside a throat. 80 feet, 78. The altimeter screamed. She silenced it with a single tap. Outside, the world blurred into shadow and streaks of lightning-gray stone. The howl of the GAU-8 cannon's spin-up mixed with the grinding roar of the engines as air clawed past the fuselage. Every shift of the wind was a threat. Every gust could pin her against the canyon wall. She rode the turbulence like a dancer in a hurricane, slipping through thermals, using them to lift and roll, her movements almost instinctive. At times, her left wingtip came within meters of jagged rock. Sparks snapped when paint scraped stone, a metallic kiss between defiance and death. In the command tent back at Bagram, radar screens flickered with static. Her signature vanished and reappeared erratically, darting too low for any system to lock. "Where is she?" one technician hissed. "We lost her signal." Colonel Harrow leaned over the console, jaw tight. "She's still down there," he said. "She just stopped asking permission from the radar." Inside the cockpit, Elaine's voice crackled over the intercom, calm as a metronome. "Still flying below radar. Give me smoke on your position." For a moment, only static answered. Then, faint, almost drowned by gunfire, came a SEAL's reply. "Bravo. 6 copies. White smoke, North Ridge Slope. Repeat, North Ridge Slope. We're pinned." Elaine's fingers tightened around the stick. She banked left, throttled down, and let the aircraft sink lower into the gorge until the altimeter stopped giving numbers and simply blinked warnings. She caught the faint bloom of smoke in the thermal display, a thin thread curling between bursts of muzzle flash. Her breathing slowed. "Got you," she murmured. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon armed with a heavy metallic clunk. She lined up the shot, the targeting reticle trembling as the canyon winds buffeted the aircraft. One breath in, one out. Then she squeezed the trigger. The cannon thundered, a brutal roar that shook the canyon. Shells the size of soda cans tore from the gun at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The north ridge exploded in flashes of orange and black, rock and flame cascading down like rain. The entire slope disintegrated. At command, the radar tech gawked at the readout. "That's not possible," she hit a ridge line from 100 feet below it. "Believe it," Harrow said. "That's Stormauler." Down below, Bravo 6's team leader raised his head, just long enough to see an armored shape streak above the canyon mouth, sunlight glinting off its wings before it vanished again. "That's Air Force," he breathed. "God bless that pilot." Elaine pulled back hard on the stick, clearing a sudden rise by a margin too close to measure. A rock the size of a truck grazed her tail, alarms wailed, hydraulics screaming in protest. "Ripjaw's fine," she muttered. "Don't you dare quit on me now." Her display lit with engine warnings, heat spikes, pressure drops. She ignored them all. Ahead, fresh enemy signatures flared on the sensors, two technicals speeding down a dry riverbed, their mounted guns already aimed toward the SEAL's last known position. Elaine swung wide, cutting across the canyon mouth, then dropped again until her wings almost brushed the sand. The trucks came into view, black silhouettes racing toward the pinned soldiers. She toggled the manual flare system. The automatic one had fried in the last burst, and loaded the next salvo herself. "Let's dance," she whispered. She cut throttle, dropped altitude, then rolled the Warthog sideways through the canyon. Flares spat from the tail, burning white against the smoke-filled air. The trucks opened fire, tracer rounds stitched past her canopy. She came in low, nose down, and fired another burst from the cannon. The first truck disintegrated, flipping backward in a spray of dirt and fire. The second veered left, tires shredding, its gunner trying to swing the weapon upward. Elaine fired again, short, controlled, and the second vehicle vanished behind a bloom of flame. Back at base, the room erupted with overlapping voices. "2 hits confirmed. How the hell?" "She's below terrain level, sir." 75 feet. That can't be real." Colonel Harrow didn't blink. "Record everything," he ordered. "If she survives, this goes straight to the academy." But the awe gave way to dread when the telemetry feed showed a flashing red, right engine overheating, hydraulics failing. A communications officer swallowed hard. "She's losing systems, sir." "She can't keep this up." "Don't tell her that," Harrow said quietly. In the drone control trailer 2 miles away, a young operator named Mason leaned toward his monitor. His MQ-9 had been circling high above the engagement zone, recording everything. Suddenly, a blur of motion cut across his feed, a ghost streaking through the shadows of the canyon. He slowed the footage. His mouth fell open. "Colonel," Mason radioed in, voice shaking, "I've got visual on her flight path. Show me." The live feed stabilized, a jagged valley seen from far above. Mason overlaid the altitude data. "Sir, she's under 70 feet. That's below the minimum safe threshold for a fixed wing in combat." 70 feet, the technician repeated. "No, sir," Mason corrected. 68. The room went silent. Even Harrow's breath caught. On the feed, Ripjaw skimmed the canyon floor like a silver ghost, vapor trails curling from her wingtips, her cannon flashing in perfect rhythm. "She's doing what no one else would dare," the SEAL commander said quietly. Inside the cockpit, Elaine's world had narrowed to seconds. Her oxygen warning flashed, followed by the master caution alarm. The right hydraulic pump was bleeding pressure, the left stabilizer half jammed. The A-10 shuddered like a dying animal. "Stay with me," she whispered, one hand steadying the throttle, the other coaxing the stick with surgical care. "Just one more run." She banked hard, rolled out behind the canyon's west ridge, and rose just high enough to clear the rock line. The desert opened before her like a wound. Through the canopy, she could see Bravo 6's position, small figures dragging their wounded, waving smoke grenades in patterns only trained eyes would recognize. She keyed the radio. Bravo 6, this is Stormauler. Corridor clear for extraction. You move now. A rough voice came back through static. Copy, Stormauler. God bless you, she smiled behind the mask, even as the alarms screamed again. Her right engine coughed, belched smoke, then steadied under her hand. Come on, girl, she murmured. Not yet. She turned back toward the canyon, one last sweep to make sure nothing moved. The sun dipped lower, painting the cliffs gold and blood red. In that dying light, the Warthog gleamed like something alive, scarred but unstoppable. Back in the command tent, Harrow stared at the live feed. She's exiting the canyon. Riley, the young crew chief, had slipped inside, still in his oil-stained coveralls. His eyes were wide as he whispered, She made it? Harrow nodded slowly. She made it, but she's not done yet. The radar tech pointed at a blip climbing over the east ridge. Sir, more hostiles inbound, trucks with launchers. They're tracking the exfil route. The SEAL commander's voice hardened. If they get a shot off before the Chinooks arrive, my men are finished. Then pray she sees them first, Harrow said. On her display, new signals lit up. Fast movers, closing from the east. She switched to the last of her 30mm ammo. Her fuel gauge hovered near empty, her engine temperature in the red. This is gonna hurt, she muttered. She dove again. The roar filled the canyon one final time, not just noise, but purpose. Each burst from the GAU-8 traced arcs of fire through the twilight. The first truck vanished, the second tried to turn but toppled under the blast. The third fired a rocket, too close, too fast. Elaine banked sharply, flares bursting in chaotic spirals. The missile veered off course and slammed into the canyon wall, detonating in a shower of dust and flame that washed over her canopy. The A-10 bucked violently. Alarms blared. Metal groaned. But she held it. Over the radio, her voice came through the static, calm, unbroken. Bravo 6, you're clear. Go home. Then silence. In the command center, the feed froze. The drone camera showed only dust curling through the canyon, fire licking at the cliffs. No sign of her. The technicians whispered prayers under their breath. Then, a crackle. Command, this is Stormauler. Canyon secure. Returning to base. Cheers erupted. Even Harrow, who rarely smiled, lowered his head and whispered something no one caught. The SEAL commander exhaled, half laughing, half crying. That woman, she just flew through hell itself. Riley wiped his eyes. Sir, she didn't fly through it. He looked at the screen where her blip reappeared, steady and rising. She owned it. The threat tone cut through the cockpit like a knife. A hard, insistent whine that meant a human being down there had found her heat and decided to end her. Elaine's eyes flicked to the left MFD, then back to the canyon splitting open beneath her as if the earth had been torn by a giant hand. She pushed the nose down until the sky clipped out. Rock filled the canopy, the walls moving past in a blur of gray and rust. Her altimeter bled digits. 90 feet, 84. 79. The seeker tone climbed another pitch. The missile team had a clean angle, tucked on a shelf where the wind bent smoke sideways and hid signatures. She could picture the posture even without seeing them, knees planted, tube lifted, spotter shouting ranges over the wind. Not today, she said. Her voice sounded quiet, almost tender. She didn't run. She drove straight at it. The A-10 shuddered as air compressed along the fuselage. Elaine eased a fingertip of left rudder, carving the nose along the canyon's inside curve. The wall slid so close that flecks of quartz flashed like starlight. At 69 feet, the missile streaked upward, a white lance shredding the air. Flares were useless this low. Climbing would hand the missile an easy brainstem to bite. She made the only move that gave her a chance, head on. Come on, she whispered, I see you. The Pipper walked up through dust and heat shimmer. The GAU-8 spun up, a metallic growl that vibrated through her ribs. The missile loomed larger, a burning pupil. She fired. 30mm shells stitched a line of annihilation into the sky. They met the missile with a flash so bright it erased shadow, a globe of flame blooming in front of her like a sun being born too close. The blast slapped Ripjaw broadside. The cockpit lurched. Warning tones cascaded into a single furious wail. Right engine flamed out and tried to relight. Hydraulics dropped. The nose rolled. For a blink, gravity owned her. Elaine let the roll come, then caught it with a cross control that had no checklist name. Left aileron. A feather of trim. A touch of throttle on the sick engine to stabilize gyros even if it didn't make power. She felt the air more than she saw it, hands reading the pressure like braille. Rock filled the windshield. She could smell hot resin and a faint tang of burning insulation. She breathed once. Then twice. The canyon throat widened by a body's length. That was enough. She skimmed through, a hair's breadth between wingtip and stone, and kicked the nose flat again. On the Met, the world went to snow. In the command tent, her icon vanished. The drone feed washed to dust and glare. Telemetry, mid-string, snapped to dashes and an empty field. "Stormauler, respond," Harrow barked. His voice carried farther than he meant it to. Static hissed back, thick and unbroken. A technician slid his headset off one ear and swallowed. "We lost her," he said, not quite believing he'd said it. The SEAL commander stood very still with his hands on the edge of the table. His jaw worked once. Then he stared at the empty grid as if staring hard enough could pull her back. In the hangar, Riley froze with a wrench still in his fingers. The floodlights buzzed overhead. No one spoke. Mechanics who swore loudly at strip bolts and bent struts suddenly had nothing at all to say. 12 seconds stretched like wire. Elaine rode the tumble out. The right engine coughed twice and stayed dark. The left held with a sound like a stubborn heart. She trimmed for the asymmetry, felt the plane resist, then consent. The shockwave's aftershock bled away in shivers. Smell came back first. Hot metal. Ozone. Burnt cordite. Her hands steadied. The world narrowed to thin lines, horizon bar trembling, rate of climb barely above sync, a canyon that wanted her bones. She keyed the mic. "Targets neutralized," she said, calm as before. "Bravo 6, move now." In the tent, men who had forgotten to breathe let air out in audible sobs. The technician laughed once in disbelief, a short bark that turned into a cough. Someone smacked his shoulder. He didn't mind. Harrow closed his eyes and let his head drop for a heartbeat. When he lifted it, his face had that set again, the line he used when he made decisions he'd carry for years. On the drone trailer screen, the feed stuttered back, then steadied. Mason dragged a finger across the timeline and scrubbed frame by frame through the blast. The A-10 appeared again as a ghost wing low, nose down, then knife flat, skimming the canyon floor through smoke that trailed like torn banners. "Sir," Mason said, voice thin. "I've got her again." Harrow didn't look away from the telemetry column that had reappeared like a heartbeat. "Airspeed." "Ooh." "Pitch." "Roll." "Altitude." Then something inside him went white and still. He had seen those numbers before. Not the magnitudes, those were insane, but the cadence, the ratios, the way the pitch change paired with roll damping and throttle blips to make lift where there shouldn't be any. It wasn't flying as they taught it. It was flying as if gravity could be misdirected by rhythm. He remembered a file that had never left his desk. Gatefire. 2 jets limping blind inside a winter system that had eaten satellites and radios and nerves. A third aircraft guiding them with lights off, dancing between flashes of lightning and the shapes of mountains glimpsed only as negatives. The debrief line had been dry. Unconventional low-altitude pathfinding during severe meteorological event. The numbers had not been dry. They had sung. He heard his own voice before he knew he'd spoken. "It was her all along," he whispered. She's the one who brought Gatefire home. The room tilted toward him. An intel officer blinked. Sir? Harrow's eyes stayed on the telemetry as if it could hear him. That maneuver. The way she dials roll into pitch at low speed without bleeding lift. The timing on the throttle bumps. That's the storm line. The word drifted out and made men who had never heard it feel as if they had. It carried weight from another night and another set of lives. Across the table, the SEAL commander straightened as if waking. He hadn't known that story. He didn't need to. He heard enough in the colonel's voice. That woman just saved my men, he said. No one argued. Radios crackled with other business medevac routes, exfil triggers, Overwatch handoffs. But for a moment those were only practicalities orbiting a simple truth. Out in the canyon, Elaine eased Ripjaw to the right, letting the left engine pull and the right wing float. The sky over the east ridge was starting to dim from amber to iron. Dust climbed in veils where her cannon had torn slopes open. The wind had its old voice back. She checked the gauge that mattered. Ammo count. Not much left. Enough to persuade. Bravo 6, she said. Corridor clear in 3. Be ready. A voice came back, ragged but controlled. Copy, Stormhauler. We are moving. She pictured them without effort, backs scraping stone, one man carrying another's weight, somebody cracking a joke he didn't feel, so the youngest wouldn't hear his own heart. She'd heard those breaths before, in other valleys with other names. The left engine hiccuped when she asked for power. She gave it time instead of throttle, and it settled, like a horse that didn't like the spur but would run for a hand on the neck. Stay with me, she said to the plane. We're not done. The control tent's noise rose again, purposeful now. A satellite relay came up long enough to ghost a picture to a command center 3 countries away. Someone there would want a clean narrative. They would not get one. The math would look like disobedience until it was written as doctrine. Riley drifted to the side of the tent flap and didn't cross it. He wasn't cleared. He stood in the wind that leaked in and watched the corners of maps lift and settle with each gust. He thought of the patch he'd stitched and the way her thumb had brushed it as if it were a promise, not a token. On the screen, Ripjaw's numbers made a pattern that didn't show its seams. Pitch changes came like heartbeats you could set a watch by. Roll corrections dovetailed with gusts the station hadn't measured yet. The jet propulsion kids would have arguments about it for years. Harrow knew better than to call it magic. He knew exactly what it was. It was a person who had decided that her fear could ride in the back seat while her hands did their job. Wind shift on the eastern mouth, a controller said. She's going to get hammered on exit. Not if she lets it hit her, Harrow said quietly. They looked at him, unsure. She doesn't fight it, he said. She borrows it. On cue, the A-10 slid into the narrow, dirty air pouring off the ridge. The nose bobbed once, as if acknowledging, then tucked, then rose. The path she traced wasn't straight. It was true. Stormhauler, the SEAL commander said over the open net. Rank be damned, protocol forgotten. This is Vandal Actual. We are on the move. You bought us a road. Elaine's smile was small and private. Keep it, she said. I don't need it after you're gone. She hung there a few beats longer than Prudence liked, eyes on the thermal field, watching for any flicker that might bloom into another tube and another streak of smoke. Nothing moved that needed to. The canyon's breath evened out. Command, she said at last. Stormhauler exiting. Recommend immediate ingress for lift. I'll ride shotgun. Copy, Harrow said. The single word carried 1,000 more. The SEAL commander took his hands off the table. His palms were lined, old scars gone white with the strain of the last minutes. He let them fall to his sides. He looked at Harrow. Harrow looked back. Tell me later about Gatefire, the commander said. Harrow nodded once. I will. And tell me her name again, the commander added, though he already knew. He wanted to hear it said like a toast. Major Elaine Kitt, Harrow said. Stormhauler. The commander breathed out and allowed himself, for the first time that night, a thin grin. Major Elaine Kitt just did what men write off as myth, until it happens in front of them. In the hangar, someone who never prayed said a graceless, grateful sentence to nobody in particular. Riley swiped at his eyes with the back of his hand and left a black streak of grease across his cheek. The drone feed widened as the operator climbed the camera. The canyon lay behind her now, smoke rising in shy threads, the floor marked by fresh scars like handwriting. Ahead, the exfil corridor angled open toward a sky-going steel. If anyone had been close enough to see the cockpit, they would have found a woman with sweat drying along her hairline and a mouth set in a line that meant she was not yet willing to feel what she had just done. Her hands sat easy on the controls. Her shoulders had the posture of someone who had just remembered a truth, not discovered it. 12 men moving, a controller said. Signals live. They're on their feet. In answer, Elaine clicked her mic twice, short, plain, enough. Harrow watched the column scroll and settled on the cadence, not the values. He could feel the maneuver in his bones now, the way she made the jet's stubborn center of mass into an ally rather than a problem. He knew exactly what he'd say if anyone tried to reduce it to a line in a manual. You don't teach this first, he'd tell them. You teach it last, after humility. He kept his voice level for the net. Airspace deconflicted. Stormauler, you're clear to escort. Copy, she said. The SEAL commander stood straighter than he had in hours. He touched the brim of a cap he wasn't wearing and looked at the shape on the screen with a gratitude he would never manage to repay. Men like him measure thanks in names, spoken quietly, carried forward. He said hers, just once, under his breath. Then he looked at the moving blips that were his men and allowed himself to believe he would see them step through the tent flap alive. That woman just saved my men, he said again, not because anyone doubted it, but because truth sometimes needs to be placed on the table like bread. Outside, the wind shifted. The base lights came up a notch as dusk fell. A mechanic somewhere started the clatter of tools again because living goes on. The sound ran like a line of stitches through a night that had nearly torn open. Far away, in the Korangle's throat, the echo of a cannon shot still rolled between stone faces. It would take a long time to fade. The thrum of rotor blades reached her first, deep, rhythmic, steady as a heartbeat. 2 CH-47 Chinooks rose out of the haze, their silhouettes wobbling in the canyon's heat shimmer. Elaine leveled Ripjaw just above the extraction corridor, her left engine coughing smoke but still answering her touch. She could see the green chem lights flashing on the ground where Bravo 6 had marked their position, the tiny flares of men alive because she hadn't turned back. Then came the shout over comms, RPG! East Ridge? A single streak of fire cut the air, spiraling toward the nearest Chinook. No countermeasures left. No time. Elaine shoved the throttle forward until it hit the stop. The engine screamed. The A-10 leapt ahead like an animal rearing for one last charge. She dropped low, crossing under the transport's belly, the jet wash slamming into the rising missile. The turbulence ripped the rocket's guidance apart, spinning it into open sky, where it detonated in a harmless blossom of flame. The blast wave slapped Ripjaw broadside. Black smoke poured from both engines. Metal groaned, skin cracked, alarms shrieked. She kept flying. Package clear, she said into the radio, her voice leveled despite the shaking cockpit. Returning to base, if she'll carry me home. No one replied for a moment. Then Harrow's voice came back, quiet, raw. Bring her home, Stormauler, that's an order. The climb out of the canyon felt endless. The A-10 limped along on half its power, hydraulics bleeding out, the stick heavy as stone. Elaine talked to the aircraft under her breath, coaxing rather than commanding. Just a little farther, old girl. We've done worse. At Bagram, the runway crews waited in a line of flashing lights. Smoke trailed behind Ripjaw like a storm cloud tethered to her tail. The landing gear came down halfway, one wheel stuck. She touched down anyway, riding the shuddering frame across the tarmac. Tires burst. Sparks screamed under the fuselage. When the aircraft finally ground to a halt, its nose dipped and the engines died with a groan that sounded almost like a sigh. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the base erupted. Cheers, shouts, applause echoing across the flight line. Mechanics sprinted toward the wrecked jet, fire extinguishers in hand. Elaine popped the canopy, smoke curling around her, and pulled off her helmet. She didn't smile. She just breathed. Colonel Harrell reached her first, helping her down the ladder. "You're grounded for a month," he said roughly. "Yes, sir," she answered, still staring back at the ruined aircraft. He hesitated, then added, "And you saved 12 lives." The Chinooks arrived minutes later, engines still turning, rotors whipping the air. The SEALs climbed out, dust-covered, bleeding, but walking. One of them carried a helmet cam still recording, the lens catching the battered A-10 silhouetted against the sunset. The team leader stopped in front of her. He was tall, streaked with grime, eyes bloodshot from smoke. For a long moment he just looked at her, the woman who had flown through hell for them. Then he raised his hand in a perfect salute. The others followed, one by one, until the line of men stood silent before her, hands to brows, dust swirling around their boots. Elaine returned the salute slowly, the motion precise and quiet. No words passed between them. None were needed. When they dropped their hands, the SEAL commander, the same man who had once said they were written off, stepped forward. He didn't speak either. He simply placed his helmet cam on the ground at her feet. The recording light still blinked red. Later, someone would play that footage, the roar of the Warthog through the canyon, the smoke trails, the impossible flight. But in that moment, all that existed was the hush of respect, the sound of men who had stared at death and found their savior wearing an Air Force patch and a storm on her shoulder. The sun slipped below the horizon, painting the base in amber light. Elaine glanced once more at Ripjaw, battered but still standing. "Told you we'd make it," she whispered. Around her, the applause rose again, louder this time, not for the machine, not even for the miracle, but for the pilot who refused to let the storm win. The report from Bagram reached the Pentagon before dawn. The first words typed in the summary were, "Cold, bureaucratic, unauthorized deviation from mission profile." Beneath it, a line stamped in red, "Pilot grounded pending review." For 2 days, that phrase followed Major Elaine Kitt like a shadow. Interviews, debriefs, endless questions from people who had never smelled jet fuel or heard a GAU-8 roar. She sat in a stark white room, while officers in pressed uniforms flipped through data charts showing altitude dips and fuel readouts, pointing at each anomaly like it was a crime scene. One colonel across the table said flatly, "You broke every low flight safety regulation in the manual, Major." Elaine looked at him evenly. "Those manuals don't cover dying men." Silence spread through the room. Someone cleared his throat, uncomfortable. When the hearing adjourned, she walked out alone, her flight suit stripped of patches except one, the hand-stitched thundercloud and wings on her shoulder. Back at Bagram, Colonel Harrell gave his statement to the press. Cameras waited, reporters ready to dissect the story into headlines. Harrell ignored them all and read from a sheet of paper that trembled slightly in his hands. "She disobeyed protocol," he began, pausing for effect. "But she did it for 12 reasons, every one of them still breathing because she went." He looked up, eyes hard. "You can court-martial courage, but you can't erase it." That clip aired on every military channel within hours. Then came the satellite confirmation. The telemetry team released the flight data to the Pentagon, where analysts stared in disbelief. Between 65 and 73 feet above canyon floor, sometimes lower. For nearly 14 minutes, the A-10C Ripjaw had flown where physics said it shouldn't. The flight path was reconstructed into a 3D model, its jagged loops like the signature of defiance itself. Someone in the press called it the storm line. But the story didn't stay inside the walls of the Pentagon. 3 days later, a Navy SEAL from Bravo 6 uploaded his helmet footage. The thumbnail alone froze half the internet, a canyon filled with smoke and the unmistakable shape of an A-10 screaming past, tracer rounds cutting through chaos. The caption read, "This angel flies below radar." Within 24 hours, it had 2 million views. By the end of the week, 10 million. Soldiers, veterans, pilots, People who knew what courage sounded like when it wasn't dressed for ceremony flooded the comments. "That's not an aircraft, that's an oath with wings. When she dove, she didn't just save them, she reminded us why we fight. Stormauler, that name fits." Someone edited the video with radio chatter layered beneath, the faint echo of her calm voice cutting through static, still flying below radar. "Give me smoke on your position." It became a kind of prayer, replayed in barracks, classrooms, and hangars across the country. Elaine watched it once. Just once. Alone in her quarters. The glow of the screen reflected in her eyes as the footage showed her jet skimming through the canyon's narrow throat. She winced at the sound of her own breathing in the clip measured, steady, human. Then she closed the laptop and exhaled. Her temporary grounding turned permanent in the months that followed. Officially, it was called Reassignment for Safety Protocol Review. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. They couldn't punish her without admitting the manual was wrong, so they rewrote it instead. Low-Altitude Engagement Doctrine, Section 7.2, Paragraph 5. The new clause was simple. Pilots may, in extreme circumstances, rely on instinctive terrain navigation if all other systems fail. They never named her, but every pilot who read the addendum knew. By the time she transferred to Nellis Air Force Base as an instructor, her legend had already outrun her. Trainees whispered the name Stormauler like it belonged to a ghost. They came to her simulator sessions expecting to meet a myth and found a quiet woman with kind eyes and a voice that carried authority without weight. On her first day, a young lieutenant asked timidly, "Ma'am, how did you fly through that canyon?" "What did it feel like?" Elaine smiled faintly, tapping a finger against the console. "It felt like being alive with no guarantee of staying that way." He looked confused. She softened. "It's not about fearlessness. It's about clarity, the kind that only comes when you stop hearing the noise." Years later, when a journalist tracked her down for an anniversary interview, she almost refused. But the request came with a note handwritten by a SEAL she hadn't seen since Corangle, just 2 words, "Tell them." So she sat beneath a hangar, awning as the sun dipped low, the interviewer's recorder blinking red. They asked her why she'd risked her life when every calculation said to stay grounded. Elaine stared out at the horizon, where the desert heat shimmered like ghosts rising. "Because they weren't gone yet," she said quietly. "And if nobody else will dive into the fire?" She paused, her voice lowering to a whisper. "You become the storm." The journalist didn't speak for a long time after that. The wind filled the silence, carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and the distant hum of engines. In the years that followed, they painted her call sign on the wall of the flight school, Stormauler. Below it, smaller letters read, "Low enough to matter." Pilots still told her story, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes trimmed down to fit a lesson, but the heart of it never changed. When courage and caution collided, one woman chose both. She didn't defy gravity to be reckless. She did it because lives waited at the bottom of the canyon, and she refused to let them vanish into static. And somewhere in a museum years later, under the preserved nose of Ripjaw, there would be a plaque with her quote etched in brass. "They told me it couldn't be done, but I knew better. Sometimes when no one else will dive into the fire, you have to become the storm." The first light of dawn crawled across the Corangle Mountains, brushing the scarred cliffs in shades of gold and ash. Wind whispered through the canyon where metal once roared, carrying only silence now, the kind born from sacrifice. In that stillness, the legend of one pilot lingered, etched not in medals or ranks, but in the lives she refused to leave behind. True courage isn't loud, it's precision under fire, the kind that flies through storms and comes back changed. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of valor. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come.